I'm Pat Morrison with the Los Angeles Times. We're talking about the reaction today across the country, even around the world. President Macron of France has weighed in on this about the Supreme Court's decision upending 49 years and 5 months of a woman's right to a legal and constitutional abortion in the United States, a federal right. It now falls upon the states to decide what to do in terms of banning or legalizing abortion, continuing to legalize legal abortion in their states. Molly Hennessy-Fiske is an LA Times national correspondent who joins us from a clinic in San Antonio where she has spent the morning. Hey, Molly, how are things there?
Hi, thanks for having me. So there's been a lot of confusion, especially for patients who were showing up for scheduled appointments here. While I was here sitting in the lobby, the staff from the clinic had to come out and explain to the women who were waiting to get abortions, medication abortions, and surgical procedures that the Supreme Court had just ruled and they were not going to be able to get their abortions today. There were also protesters outside. A protester came up to the door and came actually in, like, sort of leaned into the clinic and announced the Supreme Court has just ruled abortion is illegal, and staff had to go chase her away.
What was the reaction to the women who were there for their appointments who were told this can't happen?
So a lot of them were very surprised. A few had been tracking what was going on with the Supreme Court, but most of them had not. About a half dozen of them had traveled from outside of San Antonio, some from as far as Oklahoma, and they just couldn't fathom having to travel a long distance again, because the nearest clinic, the clinics that this clinic was referring women to, are in New Mexico, Colorado. I mean, a really long, like a day's drive at least. And those places are have already been inundated with patients from nearby states like Oklahoma, which recently enforced an abortion ban that functionally closed all of the clinics there. I mean, some are still open, but they're not doing abortions.
And of course, that means that the staff had to deliver the bad news, the staff that had been there for quite a while, I suppose.
That's right. And there were staff who were crying, and some of the women were very frustrated with the staff, the women who had come to get abortions. Some of the women were extremely sympathetic and saying, you know, don't feel bad. You've really done a lot to help people keep fighting. And there were women who said they did plan to travel out of state or to try to get abortion medication by mail.
Now, each state in each of the red states that has banned abortion or plans to in the wake of the Supreme Court decision, each of them has a different timetable. In Missouri, it was signed into law immediately this morning. The governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, sent state employees home from work to celebrate with a day off, to celebrate the end of Roe versus Wade. What are different states doing? I understand even Louisiana is hesitating in some clinics and saying, well, let's wait and see what the law is going to provide.
Well, yeah, I live here in Texas, and so I wanted to be here for that reason. I've covered the various abortion laws that have passed here during the past decade. But the other reason I wanted to be here is that Texas is one of 3 states that have a so-called trigger ban. But these 3 states, there's 16 states that have trigger bans, but of those 3 have trigger bans that are not supposed to take effect for 30 days, technically. However, Texas's attorney general, the state attorney general, said that even though the trigger ban doesn't take effect for 30 days, another law superseded that, which is the law that was in effect before Roe was passed, the pre-Roe abortion ban. And so because of that, the clinics are still trying to get legal advice and figure out what they're supposed to do. And so out of an abundance of caution, they had to say today, we can't do abortions because that pre-Roe ban would mean that doctors would be subject to a potential life sentence and a $100,000 fine.
Are you seeing that most clinics are erring on the side of caution to protect their staffers from any of these consequences, which at this point, it's unknown whether they may be on the books, but whether the states will choose to enforce them?
Well, I think it also depends how close other clinics are. For instance, I had talked to folks at a Trust Women clinic in Wichita, and under Kansas law, they can still continue operating. There is a referendum on a constitutional amendment coming up in August that would make abortion illegal, but that hasn't happened yet. So they feel protected enough to continue doing abortions in Kansas, and that's in Wichita, that's right across the state line from Oklahoma, so they can get women coming from Oklahoma, from Texas, from other surrounding states. But I think the real issue is going to be in the Deep South, here in Texas, in these larger abortion deserts where women have to travel really far in order to get a procedure. And remember, there are certain states, a half a dozen states and the District of Columbia, so 6 total, where there are no gestational limits. You can get an abortion whatever point you're at in your pregnancy. But in a lot of other states, including California, there are limits on that. So if a woman has already been delayed in getting care, like there were some women here who had tried to get it in Oklahoma, then got delayed, had to come to Texas. If you're far enough along in your pregnancy, it starts to limit your choices more in terms of where you can go, what states allow it. So certain states like New Mexico and Colorado, which do not have gestational limits, are really going to be slammed. The DC doesn't have gestational limits, Oregon, even Alaska. So we may see women traveling really far because that's their only option.
Is it yet known how aggressively states intend to enforce these bans, whether they're talking about the patients, the women, or the providers themselves?
It's not. I can tell you, I had talked to like the chief lobbyist for Texas Right to Life here, and he had said they do really want to focus post-roe on enforcement of specifically medication abortion laws. So Texas has a law in the books that was recently passed that restricts medication abortion or the distribution of it, but federal law protects the mailing of it. So I think we're going to see future legal battles over that, and also over women being able to travel out of state to get procedures. Also, a lot of women have relied in recent years on abortion funds, these nonprofits that help pay for their travel and for them to get the procedures, which a lot of people don't know, but if you're getting an abortion later in your pregnancy, it is a lot more expensive. The procedure is more complicated. There's various reasons, but the expenses start to add up the later it is in your pregnancy. So those abortion funds are also anticipating having legal problems post-roe, that they may not be able to fund abortions in certain states or even travel for women out of state.
Depending on how aggressively the states choose to pursue this, this would also raise new federal constitutional questions. Can states decide to interfere with the right of its residents to travel, for example? Can states interfere with telemedicine, which is electronic and across state lines, or even stop aspects of the U.S. mail when it comes to delivering some of these abortion drugs? So that's going to send people back to the courts again and again and again over these, and you wonder how much energy the states intend to devote to that, or if they're just happy to be able to enforce these bans within the state or the state borders.
Yeah, there will be a lot of issues, and also added issues around the abortion medication. I did a story about a month ago down in the Rio Grande Valley on the Texas border, where you can cross to Mexico and legally buy one of the abortion drugs, misoprostol, and bring it back legally, as long as you're able to cross the border legally. And I don't know what's going to happen around that, but that has been an avenue for some people. And a number of the women I talked to down there had said they had considered doing that, or they had previously done that to end a pregnancy. So I don't know what's going to happen around that, especially in Texas versus other border states.
Knowing that this ruling was likely coming down, given the leak last in May to Politico, and anticipating with the federal, with the Texas law, with the limit, the gestational limit, that the Supreme Court refused to put on hold, along with other laws that were making their way through from the states up to the federal court, had abortion providers already been pretty prepared for this, and it was just a matter of timing that they could say, all right, we know what we have to do to shut down or to limit services, and we're ready to do it?
I think they were ready, especially after the leak. However, there's a difference between being ready and then having to actually try to comfort patients and provide them with viable options. And also the legalities of it. I mean, these are medical staff; they're not lawyers. And so, for instance, after the Texas's 6-week abortion law took effect last fall, this clinic that I'm in, they continued doing abortions, and they got sued because the way the law was structured, it wasn't a criminal law. There were civil penalties where somebody could sue you if you kept doing the 6 weeks. And they kept doing them, they got sued, and not much came of those lawsuits. So they were thinking they would probably be able to continue even after Roe was overturned, given that 30-day lag time in the trigger ban taking effect. That didn't happen. So I think they were pretty frustrated that they couldn't keep going and in some way challenge the law, but they had to abide by what it looks like the law is.
A number of clinics do provide a broad range of reproductive and health services for women. Are these clinics concerned that even if they stop providing abortion services in accordance with the law, that they're going to face legal problems and heightened scrutiny from state officials?
I think that certainly is a concern. I was just talking to the clinic administrator here, and she was noting that Texas law that was in effect before had civil penalties. This is now these are now criminal statutes. And so there are questions about, like, how is it going to get enforced? What happens if someone makes a complaint? Do the police come and investigate? What do they do? What could the penalties be? So I think that's all like an open question right now. And there's certainly people who are concerned about that. And with abortion medication as well, like the existing distribution methods for that, the websites that exist, will that still be legal? How will that get investigated? Here at the clinic, they're going to remain open to see. They still have patients who are coming for follow-up who already got medication abortions, but they're not sure if they worked. And if they didn't work, then they're going to have to go out of state to get follow-up care, to get a procedure. So that's another thing that's like a question, like what's going to happen to those people.
People will remember that the Texas state law got around the then existing Roe versus Wade protections by putting enforcement in the hands of citizens in what some people call a vigilante law, that an individual citizen could find and fine and take to court someone who got an abortion or who helped someone else get an abortion. What happens to that law now? Is that superseded by Roe and it all becomes criminal and it's taken out of the hands of individual states or individual citizens and put back in the hands of the states?
Correct. I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but that's my assumption, and that we can expect to see more laws, policies proposed specifically out of Texas, where we've seen, once that law took effect, there have been a lot of anti-abortion activists who said they want Texas to become an example of what a pro-life state could look like. So I think we're going to see a lot more attention on the pro-life pregnancy centers, on the state funding that goes to them, increasing state funding for that, but also on enforcement of, like I mentioned, the medication abortion restrictions that are on the books that haven't really been enforced because the focus has been on the clinics. And in talking to the Right to Life lobbyists and activists, they have been really paying attention to the fact that the pro-abortion folks have really been emphasizing medication abortion as an alternative post-Roe. And so they're kind of readying their forces to counter that.
10 years ago, many of the laws that were being drafted in the individual states to ban abortion did make exceptions for rape and incest in the life of the woman. But even that now seems to have gone by the boards. Is there any movement in those areas that you see in some of the states that you cover that have to do with saying, well, maybe that's too far, that banning abortions from consequence of rape or incest is too far?
Well, here in Texas, the law that took effect last fall has no rape or incest exceptions. Our governor said that the focus should be on ending rape, not on adding those exceptions to the abortion laws. So, there's that response. There are folks I've talked to, pro-abortion activists or academics who've said that they think once we enter this post-Roe world, that we're going to see more people, taking notice of the lack of those exceptions and maybe amending the state laws to reflect more of a sensitivity to that. There also are not exceptions in the laws for fetal anomalies, which I think a lot of women, often women with planned pregnancies, don't realize that if they find out that the fetus has a serious condition, that means it wouldn't be viable after it won't be able to live once it's born, that they can't get an abortion in most states if they're, often these anomalies are not detected until late in their pregnancy. So even in a state like California, they were past a certain point, they couldn't get an abortion. They would have to travel to Colorado or New Mexico or one of those half dozen states that don't have limits. So I think as we see more women encountering that, you may even see the law change in places like California, so that those limits get removed. But immediately there aren't those exceptions. And even in states that do have exceptions, like there's a well-known exception for to save the life or preserve the health of the mother. And that was something that was used pre-Roe as a way for doctors to give women abortions. The clinic I'm at, Dr. Alan Braid here, he trained pre-Roe here in Texas, and he remembers giving women abortions and that they would get a psychiatrist to sign off on the fact that if they didn't get an abortion, they would be suicidal. But the expectations, experts say, is that it's going to be much harder to meet that standard now post-Roe.
Some years ago, I interviewed an OBGYN here, a fairly well-known one, who had trained before Roe and had worked in what hospitals called the septic abortion wards, where women who self-induced abortions often also induced infections or lost their own lives in some cases. Are hospitals in Texas anticipating a flood of, or even some patients who now will begin to try to self-induce, who will fail and who will have to come to the hospital for treatment because there are legal as well as medical consequences there?
So yes, and actually abortion clinics have already seen women and treated women who tried to do what are called self-managed abortions with abortion medication. They maybe got, like I said, from Mexico or from somewhere else and had complications, bleeding, or were afraid it didn't work. About a month and a half ago, I was down in the Rio Grande Valley, like I mentioned, and I went to an abortion clinic in McAllen, and some of the women they had seen had that happen, and they came in trying to make sure that the self-managed abortion they'd done had worked and had to get treated for those complications. So yes, there is a concern that that's going to increase. And the University of Texas has a research group that's been studying the impact of the Texas law. And they just released a report that said they've seen a lot of issues at Texas hospitals with providers not being sure what they can legally do for women who come in with complications. And so that's something they anticipate happening more in other parts of the country. There's also concern about what kind of training medical students and doctors are going to even receive on abortion now that there's all of these limits. So will there even be people available who can provide treatment?
It sounds as if we have one answer from the Supreme Court today, which is there is no federal constitutional right to legal abortions for American women, but many other unanswered questions have been set in motion in consequence of this.
That's right. There's a lot of confusion, a lot of chaos, and the women that I saw today were very stunned, and some very frustrated and upset because they've already been dealing with a web of restrictions in this part of the country that makes it very difficult to get an abortion. It was really a diverse group here, Black, white, Indian American, Latino, women of all different ages, many of whom already had several children. And they were all facing a lot of financial challenges, life challenges. Many of them didn't have cars. They came in an Uber. So traveling, to New Mexico was like an unimaginable thing.
Did any of them say they're just going to have to give up?
Some of them did say, one woman said she was going to try to travel out of state again. She had to work. She had taken time off work to come down here from Oklahoma. She has, 2 kids. She had to, take care of them. So she said she was going to try, but if she couldn't, then her only other option was to keep it. Another woman I talked to said she really couldn't travel. And so, if she traveled, it would have to be like 15 hours. And to her, she said, I think I'm just going to keep it. I can't think about doing that.
Molly Hennessy-Fiske is a national correspondent for the Los Angeles Times, who's been covering the anticipated impact of the end of legal constitutional federal right to abortion. She's been spending the day at a clinic in San Antonio, Texas, which had some of the most restrictive abortion laws, and now, of course, the Supreme Court has acted to make sure that those laws, if the states choose to enforce them, can go into effect. Molly, will be looking for your reporting on the LA Times website. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
The LA Times here will be talking about the impact of that Supreme Court decision today throughout the western states, throughout the United States, both legally, in terms of medical, social, cultural impact of overturning a legal support of the constitutional right to an abortion that has been on the books, on the federal books, for 49 years and 5 months. The Supreme Court ended that cross-generational ruling today on a 6-3 ruling. We're talking about the consequences, and we'll continue to do so with more of our reporters and their insights back again at the top of the hour. I'm Pat Morrison. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you then.